Prime Minister Harris will open with a statement.
Thank you very much. As you have just said, we have just recently concluded the 30th Inter-Sessional meeting of the CARICOM heads of government. We have been at this meeting over the last 2 days, and it has been intensive and extensive work on a wide array of matters of interest to the people of the region. We believe that our meeting has been a good success and that the momentum and the renewed interest that has been generated in the integration movement, that momentum continues. For instance, all member states participating in the CSME have now signed the protocol on contingent rights. 9 countries have agreed to apply provisionally the protocol. This means that the nationals of those countries, their spouses and dependents, will benefit from additional rights, such as primary education, when they move from one member state of the community to another. One member state of the community to another. We have also reached agreement on a protocol to deal with public procurement that would open the regional market for goods and services procured by public entities. 2 countries signed this agreement during the course of the meeting. The issue of blacklisting occupied our attention given the deleterious effect on the economies of many of our member states. We view the EU's approach to tax good governance as an infringement of our sovereignty, coercive and harmful to the future of a key economic sector in CARICOM, without the EU providing any empirical evidence of instances of tax avoidance. We have devised a multi-dimensional strategy to both protect our sovereignty and safeguard our relations with one of our major partners in the European Union. We have also asked the EU to cease the blacklisting of CARICOM states, to cease with the blacklisting of CARICOM states which have already made commitments to reform their tax structures in good faith. Our discussions on the situation in Venezuela resulted in a statement which is attached to the communique, and this statement sets out our position and actions in going forward to attempt to assist in resolving the difficult situation which pertains in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We also discussed the situation in Haiti and issued a call for all stakeholders to put the national interests and the well-being of the people of Haiti above all else. In that regard, we are urging that they prioritize dialogue and settle the differences peacefully. There were excellent discussions with the President of Estonia, and both sides agreed to continue to explore areas of cooperation in information and communication technologies and e-government. Estonia, of course, is a success story in the application of ICTs. The President emphasized the value of the digital economy to economic growth and development, particularly for small countries. We look forward to cooperation initiatives between CARICOM and Estonia in order to advance the digital development of the community, including the CARICOM Single ICT Space and the CARICOM Digital Agenda 2025 initiative. All in all, we have had a very successful 2 days, which would redound to the benefit of the citizens and, of course, to our international image. I want to pause here and allow the Secretary General to perhaps say a word or two, but this is the official statement, a copy of which will be made available to you, the members of the media.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say that we've had, as you said, 2 days of intensive discussion. I think the meeting was very successful in covering a number of areas, CSME. We also had an agreement on the return and sharing of recovered assets, which was open for signature. It's one of the tools in our arsenal to fight against transnational crime in our community. We took stock generally on matters pertaining to where we are on the CSME and other areas such as transportation. So we had a very comprehensive discussion on all of these various areas. And we have a communique which is being issued momently, and you will see what we have declared in our communique. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We are now open for any questions.
And please, when asking your question, state your name and the agency you represent.
I want to recognize colleague Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Comrade Ralph Gonzalez, who is here.
Yes, go ahead.
Given that all of these summits, I'm Dr. Patrick from Wiki. Given that all of these summits are always branded successful at their conclusion, and I don't think any diplomatic summit has been concluded without the statement successful in it, what sort of things do you think that you failed in and will look to improve at the next summit? And I can give you one to start off with. I think the failure to address the India and Pakistan issue, which is very recent and very important in the global climate, it undermines a lot of what CARICOM aims to achieve. So where have you failed at this summit? What was unsuccessful? What was unproductive? And will you issue a statement on your position on the ongoing conflict in India and Pakistan? Thanks.
Thank you. I think we attempted at this meeting to discuss a number of issues that were listed on our agenda. And because this was a gathering of CARICOM, the emphasis was on matters that were of particular interest to the people of the CARICOM community at this time. Certainly, other items could have been added on this agenda, but there's a limited time. And so we went through the normal processes that would allow for an agenda like this to be determined. The agenda, as came to the conference heads, was properly attended to, and it reflected the priorities that came through the various councils that determine and that makes recommendation to the matters that will go towards the heads.
Les Roy Williams, St. Kitts and Nevis Information Service. Now, regional integration is hampered by regional travel and transportation. Ahead of the meeting, it was said that the meeting will treat heavily with regional integration and regional transportation, but yet I see nothing really in the communique to state that you had arrived at any agreement with respect to regional transportation. did you arrive at any agreement with respect to regional transportation?
We discussed several matters under the rubric of regional transportation, both in relation to air, both in relation to the ferry service. And those are matters that continue to be active. We have discussed certain follow-up matters in relation to each of these. It wouldn't be normal that every matter discussed in any meeting find its way in a communique. We did say that transportation was one of the issues. The answer is yes. We had long discussions on transportation in caucus, in plenary, and they continue to be a work in progress. Yes, I don't know if you wish to add any further detail.
Chair, I think you're quite right. We looked at some issues. How could we improve on transportation? The Multilateral Air Services Agreement, a number of our member states signed on to it. The community of the COIP is the principle that one would seek to negotiate regionally on airspace. We looked at that as well. These are discussions. We mandated that further work be done in those areas. And as you rightly mentioned, we have taken a look once again at the possibility of improving maritime transportation, but much more work needs to be done in those areas. And we've set in train a course of body of work to get those areas attended to, with the aim of having some sort of progress towards the end of this year. Thank you.
Thanks. Two of the specifics to add in transportation has to do with the ongoing commitment with respect to the Multilateral Air Service Agreement, the MASA. And today we had signatories, so we are now up to 9 member states who have now signed MASA, which allows for the provisional application of that particular agreement. So we have now advanced that in having the critical threshold of members signing up with respect to that. We also agreed in principle to a need to review our domestic and other charges as they apply to air transportation, and of course to simplify and streamline relevant tax structures that may have a negative effect on the demand for and provision of air transportation services. So as I said, this continues to be a matter under advisement, under action. We discuss the possibilities and various options going forward vis-a-vis private sector engagement as against governmental or public sector engagement in the transportation sector. We are committed by and large to deliver a competitive transportation industry to the region and to ensure that in order to boost and facilitate the CSME, the free movement of people and goods, that the transportation would be affordable. There's no magic bullet, because the aviation space and industry, that continues to evolve, and we have to look at those dynamics. And we covered issues apart from the specifics in relation to MASA and the fiscal structure in relation to air travel. We'll look at some of those broad issues, and some of those issues will have to come back again to heads because they are being refined. In other words, position papers would come to heads of government. They are considered, feedback is provided, and the technicians then, or the appropriate entity, will be charged with a greater clarity to bring some refinement to the proposal and to perhaps more comprehensively address the issues of concerns to heads of government.
Mr. Chairman, Val Thomas, Sugar City FM, St. Kitts. What conclusion that CARICOM came to on the situation in Venezuela.
In relation to the matter of Venezuela, I think we outlined again the principles that have undergirded our involvement in the matter at hand. And for the record, we have always put forward the view that the people of Venezuela must be allowed to decide their own future in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter. And some of those critical principles that have formed the basis on which we have put forward our prescriptions include the principle of non-intervention, non-interference, the prohibition of the threat or use of force, respect for the rule of law, human rights, and democracy. And so that provides the platform on which we have put forward various initiatives, including the initiative that there must be dialogue between the critical actors in Venezuela to make a determination as to what kind of future would satisfy the expectations of the people of Venezuela. So that continues to be our position. We have a reaffirmation of that particular approach by the member states, which provide the basis for continuing engagement with all parties who are interested in seeing a resolution of the crisis in Venezuela.
Good evening, everyone. German Abel, WinFM. Two quick questions. One, back to air travel. Is there any specified time frame when CARICOM as a body, leaders come together, we can actually see concrete resolution being passed to sort or fix the problem of air travel, sea travels within the region? On the issue of LIAT, the LIAT Pilots Association is saying that they're concerned rather about job loss, job cuts due to quote-unquote budget cuts. Can you address that issue in terms of a budget cut for LIAT and how they're going to, we were told that CDB is basically pressing for payment of their existing loans of $60 million, and the regional leaders are the ones who have to foot that bill, or they're not regional leaders rather, but the shareholder governments of LIAT are to foot that bill. Can you guys address that issue, as well as what's the conclusion with regards to correspondent banking?
The Secretary General will address the matter of the correspondent banking. With respect to specific resolution, I think we have to be careful that our expectations are reasonable. It is well known that for a very long time, air transportation within the Caribbean region has had its share of problems. And we have different airlines, whether it's LIAT, it was BIRI, or other airlines, they have gone through their own period of restructuring and adjustment. There is within the region a strong commitment to finding an affordable and efficient means of transportation that support our integration efforts. And that continues to be a work in progress, because some of the issues that impact upon the outcome, they are very deep, they are structural, and they require a thoughtful approach. If there were matters that could be easily be done, we would not be having this conversation. If the problems, for example, that face LIAT were easy to be solved, we will not be talking about that. There will be some other matter on the agenda. Liat itself has gone through several programs of quote-unquote reorganization, restructuring, attempting to find a viable and feasible response to the expectations of the citizens and residents of the community, and those, of course, who wish to travel within. And those problems have provided some solutions for a period of time, and then they have not been sustainable in terms of our expectations for the airline. Liat is owned principally by 4 governments, I'm advised. And so in the end, because there are shareholders, the decision as to the future of Liat will first have to be thought through by the shareholders. Because Liat, like the Caribbean Airlines, is important to integration effort, we have received an update from the shareholder governments with respect to Liat, and there is a lot of solidarity to ensuring that we can achieve a sustainable model that will make Liat, or any other entity for that matter, or put them in a better position to provide the kinds of services that our people reasonably expect and ought to have with respect to air travel. And the same arguments go with respect to the ferry service. And so these are matters people talk about long ago was that vessel that would go from shore to shore. The Maple Leaf, I think, was one of those names. And
Federal Maple and Federal Palm.
Federal Maple, Federal Palm. So we passed that, and we are now looking at some consideration with respect to what is the right model. And it's not just a question in these cases of buying a ship. In the end, how will they sustain themselves? So you have to address all the logistics and other issues pertinent to finding a model that would be self-financing, or at the very least would not create fiscal problems for those who are going to be contributing to them. I am optimistic that the problems which the regional industry faces as regards to travel, that those matters have been put to the conference in the presentation which we had yesterday and today, and that the heads are seized with most of the pertinent issues, and continuing dialogue will take place. For example, I can report that based on the presentations that we had from those who were representing Liat, I have undertaken that the Cabinet of St. Kitts and Nevis will receive a delegation so that we could explore in more detail the financial and other issues impacting upon Liat, and what role, if any, the government of St. Kitts and Nevis can play as part of a constructive response to a regional problem. So we are in fact making some progress, and we are doing so in a very thoughtful way, conscious of all the other priorities, and conscious in the end that we want a sustainable formula for ensuring that the region gets the very best from whatever model is adopted. Secretary General and Correspondent Banking, sorry.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. Was the $60 million loan also discussed, and the budget cuts and the layoffs?
I am not at liberty to get into the details of a matter that has not been fully settled and for which there are ongoing discussions. So I wouldn't want to get into the specifics of some of the conversation. Suffice it to say, we look at all issues impacting the viability of LIAT. And I'm not aware that they are impending layoffs, just for the record, and I'm not aware of a 60 million figure that would have come out in the discussions. Nonetheless, that is a work in progress, and perhaps after our meeting on Monday in St. Kitts and Nevis, I might be able to speak more appropriately with regard to some of the specific matters to which you have drawn our attention.
Good night. Good night, Alicia Daniel Blake, Sugar City, 90.3 FM, St. Kitts. Prime Minister Harris, even prior to this meeting, several individual small island states have noted the unfairness of the EU blacklisting, and I note that coming out of this meeting, you have stated that the EU is to cease the blacklisting of CARICOM member states. Is this an ultimatum, and what if the EU does not comply? What is the next step?
Secretary General.
We had extensive discussions on the issue of blacklisting. The manner in which the European Union has taken it upon themselves to set certain criteria which go above and beyond criteria set by the OECD, which is the recognized international body that looks at matters of tax and good governance. In particular, extremely concerned that the opportunity for dialogue with member states who are so blacklisted or grey-listed is almost non-existent. We feel that it is significant overreach into the sovereignty of member states, and we go so far as to consider it, especially for those member states whose economy relies heavily on the revenue derived from the international business sector, an assault on the economies of these countries. We discussed, I should say to you that a team went to visit Romania, and also Brussels had discussions. We had meaningful discussions with Romania. Why Romania? Because Romania is currently in the chair of the European Union, and in particular in the chair of the Finance Council that determines those matters. And for the first time, we've had some dialogue on this matter. We raised it as well with the President of Estonia, Estonia being a member of the European Union, and put a very strong case to Estonia, to the President, as well as we did when we were in Bucharest. And we've laid out some strategies going forward. The almost arbitrary, you set one standard and the member states seek to comply, and then the goalpost moves again. So we had a long and exhausting discussion on this matter. We're going to continue in our efforts at reaching out to the European Union and to friendly countries and to countries outside of the European Union to build a case for this matter. And there are other issues that we but one of the things I can say to you is that our member states are not simply going to be dictated to and do every time that the relevant body says we must put something in place, we're going to roll over and do it. There comes a point when you have to say to them, you know, if you're not going to have some meaningful dialogue, if you're not going to have some understanding of the circumstances in which we are, then we'll have to have recourse to other things. We have 14 member states. 14 member states that collectively, when we act together, which is not infrequent, can have a voice internationally. We've done it before, and we are seeking to see how we can do this again. So we are signaling this out, and part of the process is going forward, is continuing to engage, but I think we have to make it clear that the incursion in the sovereignty of our member states is unacceptable.
I have another question.
I would just want to add, with respect to the blacklisting, it is important for us to understand that the blacklisting of countries impact negatively on the risk profile of countries, and it does in fact reputational damage. And we are concerned that there is an element of irregular behavior in the process by which member states, or any country for that matter, could be blacklisted under the EU system. So we are concerned. We do not think that it has the appeal of a democratic process, of a consensual process, and we take exception to that matter. And there is always, each time there is one problem, that problem is addressed. By the next time the EU comes around, there's a second and a third problem. So the goalpost keeps shifting in a way that makes management of the industry difficult and creates uncertainty. There's an even more significant challenge because the EU perhaps is one of the largest bloc of countries making up the OECD. The OECD is accepted as the body that will internationally determine issues of tax transparency and compliance issues. We have within the community member states that have been already adjudged and evaluated to be largely compliant, which is one of the best designation rating that one could have out of the OECD system. And then you have the EU will come. Because let's face it, the USA doesn't have a better rating than largely compliient. Few countries of the world have any rating higher than largely compliant. So when we have that sort of ranking or rating, we are among the best performers. We have complied with a lot of treaty obligations, etc. Our legislative regime would have already been evaluated. And so you could end up at times with a somewhat crazy scenario where on one hand the OECD says, you're doing a very good job, we find you to be largely compliant. And the EU, that is part of that through its own membership in the OECD, comes up with its own scorecard and says, well, basically, we want to blacklist you because you are not complying on some issues related to tax good governance. The question you ask yourself, well, which of these two entities should I be complying with? And how is it out of that same process of powerful countries? Because the OECD countries are the most successful economies in the world that are part of that grouping. And in that grouping, a significant number of them are EU member states. So you're good for one, not so good for the other. And you see this sort of confusion when you're having these differing evaluations. When we have accepted, and what is accepted globally is the OECD mechanism. So the OECD is the legitimate body, if you will. Some elements of the OECD say to themselves and to us, whatever happens there, we have our own criteria. And we are doing something different. And that pressure is being brought to bear on countries. We find that there is something capricious and irregular about that particular process. And we question the jurisdiction of the EU to take those kinds of punitive measures, because that is what is boiled down to. Unfair, harsh, and punitive treatment of member states. And so we have signaled that we find it unacceptable, and we have asked for a change of action. We will, through our own lobbying efforts and outreach, attempt to reach reasonable minds in the EU community and to ask them to share solidarity in doing the right thing and to find a process that could stand the test of time, that is credible and which is sensitive to our own challenges at this particular moment in time.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And that will bring us to the end of this evening's press conference. I want to thank the media and the members of the head table for providing the information that they have. Thank you very much.
So we will allow, since there was a request for a question before we close.
Right.
We will take two more questions. You can determine who will be the two.
Okay, I would like to revisit the Venezuelan impasse. Now, CARICOM has made known its position on Venezuela. The Venezuelan government has made known its position on countries like the US, for example. They've made known their position on some EU countries like France, the United Kingdom, Spain, and so on. Now, what is Venezuela's position on CARICOM's stance? Is there communication with Venezuelan government behind the scenes?
We have in St. Kitts an embassy of Venezuela, which perhaps is best able to speak for Venezuela. And we also have at this time high-level officials of the government of Venezuela whom I care to. What I would want to say is that the CARICOM position is not held captive by any actor or entity in or outside of Venezuela. And that is why it was important for us to find the principle. Because once we got the principles right, then everything else should flow naturally. And that is what has happened. So we have said non-interference, respect for the rule of law, the constitutional order, democracy, etc., etc. And we have said that we believe in self-determination for our people. What we are attempted to do is to offer for all parties in Venezuela our own idea that only through peace could the fulfillment of the expectations for peace in the region be fulfilled. And having regard to the proximity of Venezuela, Venezuela shares borders with Guyana, for example. Venezuela is 3 miles from Trinidad and Tobago. So you understand what proximity means. It's like St. Kitts and Nevis. And in that context, whatever happens in Venezuela will have implication for the rest of the region. The stability, we have already have a commitment that the Caribbean region should be preserved as a zone of peace. And we believe abiding by a principle of non-intervention, for example, helps in securing that and prevents the disruption of our tourism product, energy supplies, and all the other things that are occasioned whenever there is either civil unrest or military intervention in any states around the world, whether it's Iraq or any other state, Afghanistan, you name it. There's always been problems and troubles for some period of time. So we are not being held captive by any entity. We have found principles that have withstood the test of time. The same principles we are relying on now help us in good stead when we had other challenges to deal with, challenges to do with border disputes. We have always said, find a peaceful way out to deal with these particular challenges. We have always said, respect the integrity of the territory of any member state. So those things have guided us, and we are satisfied though. We are satisfied, and yes, we have had conversation with the government of Venezuela. And yes, we are wanting to have conversations too with the other forces, the Guaido team in Venezuela, because we have been putting forward through the Montevideo processes and other on our own the notion that we have to bring parties to the table. We believe that is the best that the international community can do. In the end, when rational minds get to the table, they will determine the next step. From the Montevideo process, we say dialogue, negotiation, because that's what you come to the table to do. Recognizing what is at stake for the parties, for the country, for the people, for the region. So, dialogue, negotiation, commitment, and implementation. We, along with Uruguay and Mexico, had established this four-pronged process that we think could lead to a peaceful outcome. And we are happy that several other entities are now saying that you need to have a pathway. What will they do when they get to the table? That is a matter for the protagonists in Venezuela to make a determination. We have drawn on our own experience in St. Kitts and Nevis. In 1993, we had quote-unquote confusion after the election results produced a 4-4. There were demands that the government should go back to the polls to settle it, because you had an equality of seats in St. Kitts, 4-4, and you had a case where the opposition party then had a majority, I think, of the popular votes. What happened? Reasonable actors in the society demanded eventually that there be a coming together of the political parties. Out of that, we had the Four Seasons Accord. The Four Seasons Accord determined that it was in the interest of the country that our country should have fresh elections. It was determined that elections could not be held given the uncertainty that was pervading the country, given the civil disturbances that were taking place, that it couldn't be taken in a rush or hurried way, and you had to allow for a cooling off period. That period in the end, again by agreement, was settled at 18 months. Was everyone happy? No. There were some who were on one side who thought elections should be the next week if it were possible. There were those on the other side who thought, well, we have a legitimate government. The government can function, and the government should be allowed to go to its term or to exercise all its options freely. But through consideration and dialogue, it was determined that both parties had to give something. If the parties genuinely want peace to be preserved in St. Kitts and Nevis. And so the government, with a 5-year mandate, determined in 18 months it will go back to the polls. The opposition that wanted back to the polls immediately settled for that compromise. And there were other things add-on, like, for example, access to public media, etc., coming out of that accord. So our own lived reality has been that once you get rational minds to the table, the patriotism hopefully would loom large. and people will do what is in the best interest of their country. But we can't prejudge the outcome. So we can't tell you what it is the Venezuelan people would want to have. But we believe their representatives should be able to sit down and to come to a timely resolution of that matter.
Jason Davis, ZIZ Broadcasting Corporation. A quick question on the topics of border issues and security. Was there any discussion about stemming illegal guns which enter through our porous borders throughout the region?
Under the discussion and security, we did in fact look at the porosity of the borders, that we need to look at the fact that although we were not producers of small arms, they were coming in, and that more needed to be done. And so we had the conversation along some of the lines that you're suggesting, and broader issues of engagement with our neighbors, engagement with the government of the United States of America, which is a source country for a lot of these small arms, and a multiplicity of responses, because the criminal activities really are multi-dimensional and they are complex issues. And so we attempt to have that broad view of what needs to be done. Some of the things that have to be done urgently, some of them that you will get responses positively, we hope, in the foreseeable future. So there's always the short, the medium, and long term as we attempt to address the causal factors to the extent that we can identify them involved with the problem of violent crimes in the region as a whole.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, one quick question. Under your chairmanship, would we see a word of prayer before your sessions, and would we see a CARICOM anthem eventually?
There is, in fact, a CARICOM anthem. We are reminded, and perhaps we need to play it more often at the beginning and at the end of our meetings, so that become more familiar. The matter of prayer, really, I think within the region there's a commitment to prayer and the value of that, and it is something I am sure there is no objection to in terms of the CARICOM gatherings. But the Secretary General is the man on whom we must rely for some advice in this. Estri, you have a problem with prayer?
We are a multi-faith community. That's all I will say to you. And we have to recognize we are a multi-faith community. So however we praise our Lord, it has to be within the context of a multi-faith community.